After driving the 2022 Toyota GR86 on the road and on the racetrack, I'm sold. Seriously, I plan on buying one of these cars hopefully in 2022. So when a friend told me he bought one of the first 2022 BRZs in Southern California, I was stoked for him. And because we're out here with a lot of tuning companies, this car has been used to develop and prototype a handful of aftermarket parts. Yes, this is one of the first modded BRZs on the streets right now. You see, I have a hunch that just like the first generation models, the GR86 and BRZ are going to respond really well to some aftermarket parts and some tuning wizardry. So all this leads us to the present day. It's very early in the morning. I'm down here in southern Orange County to drive one of the first modified BRZs in this state. And boy, this is going to be a fun drive. If you're watching this, you know the basics behind the second generation GR86 and BRZ. But if you don't, click the link in the annotation above and the description below to see my full review on this vehicle when I went and drove it on the road and the racetrack. That'll really fill you in on the basic details. That said, here is the hardware stuff that you really care about. We have a revised chassis based on the first gen, very similar suspension, brakes, things like that. New engine, 2.4 liters naturally aspirated, 12.5 to 1 compression, 7,500 RPM redline. It's called the FA4DIT. It now produces 228 horsepower and 184 pound-feet of torque, which is sent gloriously to the rear wheels via a revised 6-speed transmission that shifts and drives so much nicer than the first gen. The clutch is nicer, the shifter's better. Oh, and happy news, Subaru's made the transmission stronger because racers were finding out these transmissions didn't hold up super hot in race conditions. So now this unit is improved all around. Beyond that, answer me this. How many sub 3,000 pound inexpensive compact rear-wheel drive sports cars are there really on sale today? I mean, this thing starts at 28 grand, and beyond the Mazda Miata and the GR86, the sibling car to this, that's really the only game in town these days, which is sad, but it means this is cause for celebration because Toyota and Subaru did make this car and it is absolutely fantastic to drive. It also looks quite good too, at least in my opinion. Though this one looks better because, like I mentioned, Eddie's car, go follow his channel by the way, link in the annotation above and in the description down below, is lightly modified and we have some real goodies at play here. Now the BRZ is a bit quiet in stock form, an issue this car no longer has thanks to the first upgrade, which is a catback exhaust by ARC Performance. Now, amusingly, when I first reached out to Eddie about shooting this car, he's like, oh yeah, it has a MagnaFlow exhaust on it. It's really gnarly. And go figure, because he's one of the first cars in town, he also then later coordinated with ARC and got a second exhaust made for this car. He's definitely the go-to guy around here in SoCal to have parts developed for the next-gen BRZ and 86 because, man, he is really hustling with all these different brands. It sounds really nice. It's a very similar tone to the stock car, but just a bit more decibels at the high res with the occasional nice little pop from the exhaust. It's very charming. Eddie says the MagnaFlow setup is louder, and I believe him. ARC exhausts are usually quite quiet, and this one's no exception, but it's a nice refined sound for a daily driver. sure there'll be people in the comments screaming, put headers on it, put headers on it. And yes, Eddie knows all too well. He told me he can't wait to put a set of headers in this thing and really open it up, because with the previous car, headers, E85, and the tune were really the big things that woke that car up and made it much less, well, slow. Fortunately, this thing is no longer slow because there's so much torque everywhere in the power band. Peak torque is at just 3,700 RPM, so it's very tractable. But still, it's good to know that there's probably going to be a bit of headroom in that 228 horsepower figure. Yeah, that's a pleasant noise. You'll be happy to know there's no drone with this setup, a common issue with naturally aspirated 4-cylinders and aftermarket exhausts. It sounds quite nice in here. You really notice it when the windows are down, of course. So what else is done to this car? Well, if you couldn't tell, it sits quite low, and that's because Eddie has also been working with the folks over at Eibach, who are out in Corona, California. This thing has the Eibach lowering springs on the stock shocks, as well as a set of Eibach sway bars front and rear. It's funny because in stock form, these cars strike an excellent blend of compliance and relatively low amounts of body roll for a stock car. And part of that is, of course, the suspension design. The other part of that is, of course, with the flat 4 engine, the center of gravity in this thing is so low that the roll center is way down low, and so this thing just doesn't roll as much as most other cars would. But with these slightly stiffer and lower Eibach springs, and of course the anti-roll bars front and rear, well, roll is reduced even further. I have to say I'm a little bit surprised because sometimes when you put lowering springs on stock shocks, it can be a bit crashy. But I suspect because this thing has so few miles on it, after all, the odometer has just over 1,600 miles on it, the factory shocks are still fresh enough to be able to keep up with these lowering springs. Though, as I've mentioned before, for daily drivers and road cars, if you want to maintain a lot of the OE amounts of compliance, using a lowering spring with a good shock is really a great compromise solution compared to most aftermarket coilovers, which do trade off quite a lot in the ride quality department for sharper handling because you get stiffer spring rates, adjustable dampers, things like that. I'm really glad that with this light round of modifications that Eddie has done so far, though he definitely has more on the way after talking to him, I'm glad to see that the fundamental goodness of this car has not been compromised in any way for road use, because it is very easy to get in over your head when modifying a car and make something that can be really fun on the racetrack but a bit miserable on the road. With Eddie's BRZ, well, it just sounds better, corners a bit flatter, looks much better when parked thanks to the lower ride height, and has lost very little in the way of its daily drivability. The reason, though, I really came down here to drive this modified BRZ is to see what the future of this platform is going to be like, because when the first gen models came out in 2013, they overran places like SEMA. They were everywhere, and for good reason, because like I mentioned, there are not a ton of lightweight, inexpensive rear-wheel drive sports cars with manual transmissions, and so kudos to the brands for making them, but it does have me very curious what the future is going to look like. Because this uses a revised chassis compared to the first gen model, a lot of the parts are actually interchangeable, brakes, suspension, things like that, though there are a few differences. And there are a few differences between GR86 and BRZ. They got a lot of flack originally for having no real delineation between the two other than the bumpers and the badges. But the brands have definitely changed a bit more in the DNA of the cars. Take, for example, the subframes. Things like the sway bar mounting points are different between GR86 and BRZ. So there are a few slight differences there that might hinder parts interchangeability between the models. I'm not entirely sure yet, but we will find out. Those slight tweaks also do explain the difference in personality. Now, like me, Eddie's been to the track a few times, and he was telling me that BRZ had a surprising amount of understeer in stock form, something he thinks has pretty much been mitigated with the inclusion of these Eibach sway bars. And that's interesting because GR86, by comparison, was so tail happy on the track. I thought it was fantastic. It reminded me a lot of like driving an S2000, for example. You really drive it with the rear tires and just keep the front pointed in the right direction. It's a lot of fun. I cannot overstate how much of an improvement this second gen car is compared to the first gen. Truly, the gap is enormous in every facet too. I mean, check my review for more details, but inside, outside, the way it drives, the motor, the transmission, just they improved basically everything. There's no real drawbacks here other than a slight price bump compared to the first gen. Man, am I glad that this car exists. Even if I didn't want to buy one, just philosophically, I'm glad that some manufacturers are keeping lightweight, affordable sports cars a viable option, because Eddie's a pretty young guy and he was able to swing the cost of one of these things, which is just really exciting. And like I mentioned before, I cannot wait to see a bunch of these things pop up at the racetrack, because I talked to Eddie, he's taking this thing to Buttonwillow next weekend, and that sounds like an absolute blast. For the time being, this lightly modified BRZ is a really nice sweet spot. It's just that extra bit sharper than a stock one, it sounds meaner, it corners flatter, but it isn't particularly compromised for day-to-day use. The ride is still relatively compliant and the exhaust is tame enough to not attract unwanted police attention, all while being stock enough, hopefully, to knock it on the bad side of your local Subaru service advisor, should you need to call in the warranty because this is a brand new car. Of course, this is only the beginning of the journey for Eddie and his Subaru BRZ. He has a lot more modifications planned from the sound of things. I'd love to check in with him again maybe a year down the road and see how this car has turned out. So if you'd like to follow the journey of Eddie and his BRZ, please go check out his YouTube channel. It has some really great content on there. I'm a fan, I subscribe, and I watch his videos, because all of this has just reaffirmed that I really, really want one of these cars. I need to buy one ASAP, because it seems like, just like my hunch, the more you modify it, the more you drive it, the more you like it, the more it grows on you, because this is such a good car. In any case, guys, my name is Jake. You've been watching Drive, Brake, Fix, Repeat, and I'll see you guys next time where I go do more fun things with cars. Bye.